Dwell Church just turned 2 years old a couple weeks ago. Yeah. So much fun. And part of Dwell is always an experiment because we are trying to find out what happens when you found a church on the following core values. We want to be Jesus-centered, research-based, trauma-informed, diverse, and affirming and inclusive. And what we're finding out is that fantastic human beings want to come to a church like that. I am grateful over and over again for the kind of people that come to Dwell. I'm grateful to spend some time with you all here today. We got a couple great things coming up, but one of the most important things that I hope you hear today is that we're on a quest to build a church where anyone can take a step closer to Jesus. And I hope just for like 40 minutes a day that you feel invited to take a step closer to him. Okay. Important things we got coming up. If you're new here, we would love for you to connect with us so that we could connect with you. And we got like a dozen ways to connect around here. One is you can just text Dwell to this phone number right here. We'll put it up after the service. The other thing you can do is tap your phone against the display right there on the table at the exit when you leave. No one will see you do that. You can just do it in secret, boop it. And that'll get you on our newsletter, and you can stay in touch with everybody. And, yeah, we'd love to hear your story. Okay, in a couple weeks, guys, it's going to be Easter. It's going to be fun. And we are having our standard traditional Easter fest in the parking lot. It happens from 2:30 to 4:30 p.m. Petting zoo, free Mr. Softy, bounce house, family photo fun booth. These are a blast. Last year I got so sunburned because it was really beautiful in that parking lot. So we should maybe get some Dwell Church branded sunscreen. Give that out. Everyone will use it. We'll be helping everyone in the neighborhood. Okay. One of the things we do around major holidays is we try to challenge ourselves. Now, a lot of us are coming to Dwell Church feeling like we have only just barely begun to stomach again the idea of going to church. And I had that season of my life where going to church was really hard. Every time it felt like a sacrifice. And so the challenge, of course, is for people who are really rethinking their relationship to church, the challenge is how might we invite someone else to come to church too? If I'm only a few toes in to the idea of church, how could I possibly invite someone else? And the challenge is this. It's something that around here we call evangelism trauma. That at one point in my youth, I was trained to find random strangers, tell them that they were probably going to hell, that they should come to church with me and get that fixed. That was a terrible experience for me, and I'm sure it was a terrible experience for them. And so part of our trauma-informed core value is that we don't want to just forget stuff like that. We don't want to just pretend that never happened. We don't want to just ignore that. We want to find a much better way to do it. And so we don't know yet, but we're on a mission to find out what is the way of talking about the world with Jesus, about our church attendance that feels good to us and it feels good to them. And what I think my intuition is, my own faith, I have found it so helpful to me. One of the ways we talk about our relationship with Jesus here is that it makes us feel spacious. That being in God's presence is spacious, not suffocating, not high pressure, not judgmental, but spacious. And I know so many people who need to take a step into something that makes them feel more spacious. In fact, if I just said that to them, will you trust me for 1 hour in the month of April? I think you will feel more spacious afterwards. They will probably say yes. So we're on this mission to find the way that feels good on our end and feels good on their end. Now, one of the ways we want to do that is to not say, hey, you have something wrong with you, so you should probably come to church and get that checked out. Instead, we want to say, I was thinking of you. This thing really works for me. I think maybe it could work for you too. So last year, what we did was in a service right before Easter, we all got out our phones and text messaged someone. I don't know if you remember that. But I want to read you the text message that I sent and tell you what happened. I said, hi, happy weekend to you all. I wanted to say that I know that these kinds of invites can be awkward, so really no worries if you can't make it, but I was wondering if you'd want to come to my church on Easter. No worries if not, but if you'd like to come, I should mention that the free churros and petting zoo start at 2:30. And they're good friends, but they didn't answer and they didn't come. But still to this day, they're on the PTA. I was on the PTA with them. And when something goes wrong on the PTA, they complain to me about it. So I assume that we're still friends. But I got to send them a message where I was saying, do you want to take a step deeper into my life? How could I open up my life a little bit and invite someone to step deeper in? And they said, maybe not right now, but maybe someday, right? We're still friends. We're still having this relationship. We're still journeying together. But in a world that is so intensely lonely, I think it's a major gift to give someone to simply say, would you like to come like one tiny step deeper into my life? And it's okay if not. But that's ultimately what I was asking them to do. So today we're going to start thinking and dreaming about who's that person that you might invite. I got a different person that I'm going to invite this time. Just a couple of weeks ago, they told me, you know what, I've never been to church before, but that community does seem kind of nice. It would be nice to have a community like that. Yeah, we're nice. This is actually, I think, the best part of inviting someone to Dwell. I have the utmost faith that anybody who comes to Dwell will have a great experience because we got so many great people here. So many emotionally intelligent and wise people who will not say anything too weird. It will be a good experience for anyone. Yeah, you can say weird things, but it's not too weird. I trust you to know where that is. So together, I want us to accept the challenge of finding a different way, a new way to make people feel thought of instead of uncomfortable when we invite them to church, and to do so in a way that makes it feel good on our end and on their end. That's the challenge for us over the next couple of weeks. All right, what else we got here? I think that's it. Let me see. Is this guy working today? Yes. Nope. That's the last slide. I went the wrong direction. The real button's not working right. Okay, I'm going to stop. You fix it. All right, my friends, we're starting a new series today, a series of teachings called The Ick. If you haven't been on the internet recently, the ick is a term for when you have a crush on someone, but then you find out one small detail about them, and you can no longer stand being in their presence. They gave you the ick. You have to break up immediately. Famously, my neighbor in high school, we were really good friends, and she took her boyfriend on family vacation to Cancun one spring break, and she said that after seeing him play in the waves on the second day of the trip, like she broke up with him right there, and he was stuck on the rest of the trip with the family. Like this happens. People get the ick, and they say, I can no longer do that. This is something that happens to people. And we are wondering if there are certain passages in the Bible that give you or give me the same sensation. That when we read that passage, we say, nope, I can't do this. Or we also wonder if the watching world thinks, how could you guide your life? How could you surrender your life to a set of texts that has something like that in it? Actually, the problem for this series was there's like a couple dozen of these, but we only got 3 weeks. So we're going to have some good podcasts coming up. But the one we're talking about today is this passage here from Genesis chapter 6. Like right at the beginning, God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. How could a loving God say that? How could we say with integrity, we believe in a loving God? But just skip over the ick part. That is the question we are going to ask together today. And as I said, there are a bunch of these, and I'll try to call out which ones we're going to address as we get some touch points with them. But if you've never read Genesis chapter 6, let me revisit the story for you. Things have gone poorly for the human species. For 3 chapters, all things have gone bad. And God finally decides the experiment is going so poorly that we have to pull the plug on this thing. So he floods the earth. Except for, he coaches one man to build a boat, put his family and 2 of every animal onto the boat. And for 40 days and 40 nights, it rains until finally the rains subside, and as do the waters. And Noah, this one man and his family, restart the human species. Genesis chapter 9. It's an incredible story if you sit down and think about it. Now, we're going to talk through why this is problematic, but part of the problem is that's like the first story we teach kids. Isn't it wild that one of the first things we do in church is like it's got a rainbow and a boat, and God killed everybody. Everyone alive except for these 11 people, right? It's wild. It's wild if you pay attention to it. Part of the problem is we have read these over and over again. If you've gone to church your whole life, you are so familiar with these passages that they no longer shock us. It's not even on the menu to give me the ick because I'm so used to it. So let's think about it for a bit. Okay, here's the problem. We sometimes think that being embarrassed or ashamed or worried about the violence in the Old Testament is a new problem. Like, at some point, maybe people were okay with that. But it turns out that this guy in the year 144 A.D. was the first heretic in Christian history that was, like, labeled, you are not part of us. And his idea was that the God of the Old Testament was a different God entirely. Jesus is a completely different being. Jesus is the real God. And the God of the Old Testament, the violent one, is a deceiver, is deceitful. And so he suggested we should take one gospel, Luke, take some of the Old Testament passages out of that, some of Paul's letters, and just move forward with that. And the church collectively, globally decided, no, we can't do that. That is unfaithful to the true story. So it turns out this is an ancient problem that people have been trying to solve for almost 2,000 years. What do we do about God being seemingly so violent? Oh yeah, here he is. Marcion preached that God had sent Jesus, who was distinct from the vengeful God that created the world. He considered himself a follower of Paul, the apostle, instead of the rest of the early church. So this guy's been way ahead of you trying to cut some of those passages out. The deists who founded, took Enlightenment principles and turned them into what we now call modern Western democracy, they too were deeply offended by the passages that seem to depict God as violent. And they said, actually, the number one rule of all things about human beings, it should be reasonable. And God seems unreasonable. And so they thought of God as a far-off clockworker who had made a clock that was supposed to run properly for the rest of time, and that was all of creation. And anything that violated that clockworker, reasonable God needed to be jettisoned. So they too were living by this life principle, and they said there are parts of Scripture that we don't have to believe. Later today, something that is called the Jesus Seminar said there's no miracles, there's no resurrection, anything that violates the idea of human principles, of reasonality, can be jettisoned, the deists. We have another angle on this that I'm calling the Pete and Doug problem. This is Pete Hegseth and his pastor, Doug Wilson, who took the opposite point of view. Not that these should be jettisoned, but these are the primary ways that we might actualize our faith, by following into battle this violent warrior God. And as crazy as it seems, there's been over 200 reports from soldiers over the past year that they have heard the Department of War say in some way that it is God's will for us to go to war so that Jesus can return. 200 reports from this pro-veterans, veteran support website, military.com. And so, a major problem for us is how do we enter into the public sphere and say this is not the predominant reading of this passage. The watching world is part of the problem for us. I don't know if you've ever heard of the new atheist thinker, Christopher Hitchens. I love to watch his videos. He's so smart. He's so sharp. And he says that if we pay attention to the passages in the Old Testament, Jews and Christians believe in something like a cosmic dictatorship, a cosmic North Korea is his phrase, where everyone is constantly being surveilled, everyone has to do exactly what this God says, and violence is always a threat. That is the narrative that Christopher Hitchens puts on the Old Testament. In fact, here he said, how could we ever even think about telling children about God's genocide? Isn't that in itself a form of abuse? The watching world has strong opinions about these passages. But finally, what is at stake here, part of the problem is it is our own confidence in Scripture. That we too are asking ourselves, how could we live by a text that contains something of this nature? And the best I've ever been able to do is to coach middle schoolers and high schoolers to remember the parts that mean something to you and study the rest. Is that really the best that we can do? So these passages that give us the ick become something that we have to think about together. That's the problem broadly. Here's the problem specifically. Does this passage in Genesis chapter 6 about God flooding the world, does this or does it not depict Yahweh as violent? And at least imply a justification for violence? Confused by my own question. How do we square this with Jesus' teachings? How do we square this with turn the other cheek? And finally, does this invite us into a conversation that leads us into Jesus' presence? I think a helpful question is, what do we think the Bible is? What is it for? What is it? There's a great podcast called The Bible Project, and they say it's a unified story that leads us to Jesus. And I like that. But at Dwell Church, we use something different. It's a conversation. Because sometimes, quite importantly, the Bible disagrees with itself. And you and I are in the midst of that tension. In Proverbs, the world is mechanical and just. But in Job, it is confusing, absurd, and brutal. That's a conversation in the Bible. And you and I have to spend time living in both places. Sometimes the world makes sense and sometimes it doesn't. And if we didn't have a scripture that let the world not make sense, gosh, would we be far worse off because of it. So how does a passages like Genesis chapter 6 become a conversation that invites us into Jesus' presence? Okay, two things about this text in Genesis chapter 6, that passage that we read, where God determines the human race to be too violent, determines to wipe them from the face of the earth. First of all, did this flood happen? There's actually pretty good evidence that it did. Most ancient Near East cultures have a story about a giant cataclysmic flood, and that suggests to archaeologists probably something like this did happen that got passed down, that it was like this big regional phenomenon. So interestingly, yes, something like that probably did happen, and the people had to try to make sense of it. We'll check out some of those other ancient Near East stories in a bit. But the other big question is, who is this God? We only have 6 chapters of knowing him. If you read the Bible like a novel, you would say, wait, what is this guy doing? Didn't he just say it was all good? Now he's flooding it? What is happening here? So it's helpful to get a sense of what this is like. And here's a really good text on this. This is the scholarly, like blue chip best resource so far on this that summarizes a whole bunch of different perspectives. The Violence of the Biblical God by Daniel Hawk. My professor, John Goldengate, wrote the foreword, and he said, this is a boring topic because people write on it too much, except when this guy does it. So that's a pretty good way to start the book. Daniel Hawk says, if we take a literary approach to Yahweh in the Old Testament, here's what you would learn. If you were just like asking who is Dumbledore, what is Harry Potter like, if you just asked that question of Yahweh in the Old Testament, here's what you would learn. He is a person. He is deeply personal. He is complex, psychologically complex, just the way you and I are. You are made in the image of a psychologically complex God. He is intensely relational. He seems to supervalue the relationships in which he finds himself. He's deeply loyal. He's deeply generous. He's relational. An important literary characteristic of the character of Yahweh is that he gives up at least some control to give that relationship integrity. If you're in a relationship where you have no control over what goes on, if you have no say, that relationship has no integrity. You are a puppet. You are miserable. You are controlled. Yahweh intends to have very real relationships, and so at least on some level he concedes control to us, of our lives, to the human race in Genesis chapter 3. And finally, a literary reading about Yahweh would find that he is intensely impacted by the state of the world. He cares deeply. The deist thought of God is far off, maybe didn't care so much, but the actual Old Testament God is intensely involved and concerned with the state of the world. And so when we read these ick passages, we have to think through, this is the guy doing it. This is the context in which we find it. Bit more about the text. Oh, this is what he says. If you want to know who Yahweh is, this is the text to know. This is like the emblematic Old Testament text. Exodus 34. God passed in front of Moses proclaiming, the Lord is compassionate and gracious. He's slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to the 1,000th generation, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents up to the 3rd and 4th generation. We read this part and say, doesn't that seem unfair? Can I really trust somebody who's going to keep punishing? But this is like a Hebrew way of saying God is this mad, but he is this loving. 4th generation to the 1,000th generation. If you're a spreadsheet person, this is an enormous delta of loving kindness from Yahweh. And this is the God who we are getting to know in these ick passages. Maintaining love to the 1,000th generation, but only punishing to the 3rd and 4th generation. Okay, what about the actual Hebrew text itself? This is really useful. Hebrew is a fascinating language. Greek has this huge vocabulary of very specific things, words for very specific things. It's really interesting. English, especially Silicon Valley English, is just like that. We have single-use words. Hebrew has almost no single-use words. They have a much smaller vocabulary, and they use those words for all kinds of things. It's deeply symbolic and powerfully poetic in that way. So you have to spend some time paying attention to the text itself. Here's what Daniel Hawk says about this text. This is a bit technical, but it's useful for us to know. God is not the subject of the clause of the flood, nor is there a verb of cognition used, that he's like, I know this is going to happen. Instead, the meaning of this clause is encoded with the material process. There's a sense of movement in the poetics of the Hebrew language that is used here. It's encoded with the material process that expresses movement as if a notion of the demise of all flesh passed before God and made itself evident to him. In fact, the Hebrew construction distances God from the decision-making process almost as if the outcome was already inevitable and God was merely observing it. We're left with the sense that God is not so much sending the flood to punish the world as facilitating through the flood the inevitable descent into chaos caused by human destructiveness and violence. God finally ruins an already ruined creation, and in doing so creates the conditions for reordering and renewal to take place. Grammatically, Yahweh is as far apart from the flood as you can be and be in the same sentence. That's fascinating. That's very useful to us. It tells us that the Hebrew authors of this passage already knew about this problem. They were not surprised by the moral quandary that Yahweh has found himself in. This depicts, at least if they have not resolved it, that they are aware of the problem that you and I are also aware of. How could a good and loving God do that? But if Christopher Hitchens was here, R.I.P. to that brilliant man, would he be satisfied if we said, have you looked at the Hebrew? Have you seen the sentence construction? Lets Yahweh off the hook? No, he would not. In this passage, in this book, the John Walton books are incredible. If you're looking for some resources on this, The Lost World of Genesis 1 through 3 is incredible. The Lost World of the Flood is very good. There's a whole chapter here on the nature of hyperbole in the Bible. It is a teaching instrument. When you tell a big, loud, funny story, people remember it. And as we see with the flood, it doesn't imply that it didn't happen, but it does let us know that there are exaggerated elements so that you and I remember it. And that's why we instinctually teach it to kids. It's a memorable one. We know that this is designed in a way so as to have some exaggerations that are useful for teaching. Not false, but useful for teaching. I do it every week. Just a little pastor humor there for you. It's great. Okay, what about the ancient Near East context? As I said, there are like 5 or 7 other cultures with stories about floods. It's very useful to study them. That is way too many to do in one 25-ish minute sermon. So let's just look at one, this Akkadian story from the Atrahasis, which is their sort of like Genesis. This is the flood narrative there. Here's how it begins. The land became wide and the people numerous, and the land was bellowing like a bull. It was very loud. And the god, who we'll learn in a second, is named Enlil. The god was disturbed by their uproar. Enlil heard their noise and addressed the great gods. The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar, I am deprived of sleep. So we flooded the earth. This is what the Hebrews were responding to when they told their story. That God is not annoyed by you, but thinks that you were created good and in his image to be cherished. You can see the great contrast to which the Hebrews were responding, that they had a different intuition about who God was. We're going to study what they thought in terms of God's internal logic of the flood. But here the internal logic is much like me when my children were little. I am not myself when I'm tired. Please just let me sleep. Please. All right, we're going to turn the gem. Here's how we read the Bible at Dwell Church. As I said earlier, if there is a belief for you that does not help you in your life, you should feel every freedom to jettison it. And turning the gem is the way we start to jettison some readings of the Bible that were unhelpful to us. The Bible is a conversation that we get to participate in that leads us into the presence of Jesus. And how do we know we're doing that right? It's that our Bible reading yields for us the fruit of Jesus' Spirit. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, generosity, and self-control. And so what we have to do with any passage in the Bible is keep looking for an angle that delivers those fruits of the Spirit to us. And we're going to see in a moment that even with the ick passages, if we work at it, if we listen to each other, and we listen to voices that maybe don't always get listened to, we will find a way to say that Yahweh is a God worth entrusting my life to. We're going to turn the gem together. The first is the author, Marilyn Robinson. She won a Pulitzer Prize for her book about a pastor in Kansas. And I was like, it was like in 2022 she won the Pulitzer for it. She is a brilliant novelist, and I adore her. And she is a committed Presbyterian who wrote this book, Reading Genesis. She just wrote because she was bored, she wrote a commentary on Genesis. This woman's pretty amazing. And what she suggests is one of the primary things that comes out in a literary reading of Yahweh's character is restraint. That the other gods in the ancient Near East did their best at maximal destruction. Yahweh restrains himself when he is destructive. It is a profound observation by comparison. When we're asking, who is this God? He is a God of restraint. He has the power to do so, but does not. Why? Well, because he loves those little suckers. He can't erase all of humanity because he loves them. That is what emerges when you pay attention to the inner logic of the passage. And we find that the motivation in the other ancient Near Eastern narratives is annoyance, but for Yahweh it was heartbreak, right? And the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. Why was he so heartbroken? It's because humans were violent towards one another. A completely different kind of God emerges once you start turning the gem. So this God who is motivated by heartbreak is the topic of this great book here from Renita Weems. She's a womanist scholar, so the black feminists thought that the argument between black males and white females was unproductive because they were each advocating for their own perspective. And so black feminists renamed their movement womanism, which they thought was to benefit the whole community. And they said, how will we know if the community is flourishing? It's if black women are flourishing. And that is the perspective from which they read scriptures. And so Renita Weems in this book takes the logic that Marilyn Robinson just made clear to us, that when God is violent in the Old Testament, it is because he is heartbroken. And she asks, isn't that the same kind of logic or explanation in every domestic abuse situation? Are we not depicting a God that we would never let our daughters marry? And we would hope our sons would never become? That of course if you're heartbroken, you cannot act out in violence. Wouldn't we have failed as parents? In her book, Battered Love, where she takes a look at violence in the Hebrew Scriptures. And what she concludes is that the problem here is that we think of God on default mode as male. We don't know God's gender in Genesis chapter 6. We think of God's default mode as male, and only do we remember the few times, like in Proverbs where wisdom is a woman, or maybe in the Gospels where Jesus says, I am a mother hen. Those stand out to us as the unique passages that depict God as female. But she asks, what if God in Genesis 6 is female? Those become empowering tears of rage that create the flood. And what stands out there is an act of recreation. And she draws attention to the parallels between the Garden of Eden and Noah, that Noah is asked to be fruitful and plants not the fruit of the tree of good and evil, but instead a vineyard. And just as in Genesis chapter 3, they eat from the vine and it is bad for them, so Noah too eats from his vineyard and it is bad for him. It is an act of recreation at the hands of this womanist God. Dolores Williams, another womanist scholar, takes it a different way. And she suggests what is most powerful in this passage is the sorrow that gets ignored. That Yahweh is heartbroken, not just because of the violence, but because he has been silenced. And this is something that is empowering to all kinds of people. When we start turning the gem, we start to find readings that might start to tiptoe towards something that is redemptive, or maybe a fruit of the Spirit. Finally, a scholar named Miroslav Volf used to teach at Fuller Seminary. He's a Croatian theologian, and he was a pastor in Yugoslavia during the civil war there, as the former Yugoslavia broke apart. And his family, his village, his people were Croatians that experienced unspeakable atrocities at the hands of Serbian nationalists. And this became like the crux, the core moment where he had to ask himself, does any of this help me in my life? What passes the life test when you are a surviving victim of ethnic cleansing? He wrote this about exclusion and embrace. This book's soul is captured in an exchange between my mentor and I. During my PhD program, I had just given a lecture on the peace that Jesus' presence gives you. And my dear friend and my mentor, Jürgen Moltmann, asked me, but could you embrace a setnik? Now, a setnik is a member of the Serbian national group responsible for war crimes against Croatians. And it was my honest struggle, my immediate knowledge that I could never say yes to this question, even though my Jesus and his gospel demanded it. That is the crucible in which my theology is formed. I know that if I cannot find a way to embrace my enemy, I will live my life repeating the cycle of violence. And as he thought about this problem, how do I become somebody who can truly love my enemy? What he found comfort in was passages like Genesis chapter 6, where God takes violence seriously. It was comforting to someone who was the victim of extreme violence to know that God cared about that. In fact, in this book, in an extremely challenging passage, he says, only in the suburbs could you try to believe in a pacifist God. That the God of the Old Testament takes sides with the victims. And so as we listen to different perspectives, we find that maybe there is good news. Because for Miroslav Volf, what let him love his enemy as Jesus asked him to do was knowledge that God would take care of whatever rightful vengeance was due him. And ultimately it tells us something about Jesus. See, we often think of Jesus as the full expression of who God is, and that's true. But we forget that Jesus is also the full expression of who a human being is. And so he lives in this powerful tension of being able to get vengeance and choosing not to. And somehow finding something so powerful that it can only be called resurrection in the tension of knowing you could get vengeance, but not doing so. And so Christopher Hitchens, once more, the argument that this is depicting the cosmic dictatorship undergoing cosmic genocide, we turn out to find is a thin reading. It is a straw man version, and we could do that too. But what it helps us do, what I like about Christopher Hitchens, why I enjoy listening to him, is it tells an empowering, harsh truth about Scripture that you and I need. And it is this, that if I find something in Scripture that I don't like or understand, I get to talk with Jesus about it. This is where the conversation with Jesus happens, that I get to say, God, how could you be like this? Could you help me turn the gem until I could understand this a different way? Or even we get to say, as the prophets sometimes do, God, I do not like that you are like this. This is the conversation into which we are invited. And what happens is that God asks us, which character in the story are you? See, if we are ones who have suffered real violence, this is a comforting text where we could say God does see us and is on our side. But if we are ones who have benefited somehow from exploitation or violence, then we have to take seriously that God too has seen that. And that's what we'll talk about next week. Let me pray for you. Jesus, will you please keep speaking to us? Will you please keep teaching us to turn the gem and to listen to those to whom you have spoken? God, will you help us to become people who are as deeply concerned with injustice as you are? God, will you teach us to examine our hearts and to live in ways that please you? God, and thank you for inviting us into conversation with you. Lord, I lift up now anybody here who is saying they don't like this passage. They don't like that these passages are in there. I'm grateful, Jesus, that you let us say those things to you time and again. God, so we lift up this journey of examining these yuck passages. Would you somehow speak to us through them? We love you, Jesus. Amen. There was a time when I was like, I don't think I can ever go back to church, but I had fallen in love with like the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, and I was like, I'm going to be a Hebrew Bible scholar, and I'll just teach these all day. And I was so excited when on our last, not this most recent one, but before that in community discernment, people were like, we got to talk about those weird Old Testament passages. I was like, yes, finally. So we're going to get to do that some. But first, we're going to hear from your friend of mine, Karina Wilhelms. Give her a hand.